Hey there, what's up, friends? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're starting Daf Chav. Friends, what daf we're learning today? Daf Chav Beis, Daf 22 of Masechta Megilla. Friends, the first part of the Masechta, the first part of the daf. All right, this is going to be a fun daf. The first part of the daf continues where we left off yesterday, talking about what happens when you kind of don't have enough psukim to read. So we saw the machlokas that we saw in Masechta Tainis with Rav and Shmuel about do you repeat, do you cut in half, things like that. So we talk about sort of those minimum requirements for reading from the Torah. We then discuss how many aliyas there are on a Tainis Tzibur and on Tisha B'Av. And then at the end of the daf, we talk a little bit about tachanun, a shtickle. So, and then some other interesting things along the way. So friends, let us begin on Daf Chof Beis Amud Aleph, about 7-8 lines into the page. It says Rav Omar, says Rav Doleg. Okay, so remember we saw yesterday machlokas between Rav and Shmuel at the end, right? So what happens if, let's say, you have a parsha, right? So we said yesterday in the context of Rosh Chodesh, right? So, and really, well, truth is that the machlokas is really in the context of the ma'amados, right? So we had said, we learned it in Masechta Tainis, that the Anshe Maimid were the people that would pray for the korbanos, right? Because if we have the korban tamid every single day, and the korban tamid is a communal offering, it's for the entire community, so the community should be praying for the success, praying for the offering, and be involved with the offering. So there would be these Anshi Maimad, and part of what they would do is they would read from the Torah, and some of those sections might only have 5 psukim, and they're read by 2 people. So how can you read, if you divide that in 2, it's 2.5, I guess, right? But we have to have 3 psukim each. So for each of the 2 aliyos that we divided into. So Rav says no problem. You dolig, right? You repeat. You repeat one of the verses. So the first guy does 1, 2, 3, and the second guy does 3, 4, 5. Shmuel says posek, that you cut it in half. So the first fellow reads psukim 1, 2, and half of 3, and the other fellow reads the second half of 3, 4, and 5. So that's the machlokas. So Rav Doleg. So Rav says that you repeat one of the psukim. So my taima lo amar posek. How come he didn't say like Shmuel that you just cut one in half? So kasavar kol psukim lo paske Moshe onin lo paskin only. Because Rav's opinion is that any verse that Moses did not, divide up, so we don't divide it up. If Moshe Rabbeinu decided that a certain pasuk ends at a certain place, so we end where Moshe Rabbeinu ends. We don't cut it in half. That is Rav's sort of perspective. Shmuel Amar, where Shmuel says paskin only, that you are allowed to cut it in half. V'ha Omer Reb Chananya Kara, but didn't Reb Chananya Kara say Tsar Gadol Hayuli Eitzel Reb Chanina Hagadol, that it was a very difficult thing for me by Reb Chanina Hagadol v'lo hitir li lifsok, and he only allowed me to divide up, to cut a pasuk in half. For children, because it's to teach them. Basically, Rab Chananya Kara, Rab Chananya, the sort of person who was associated with reading verses from the Torah, so he wanted to be able to divide verses up differently, to divide them in half or whatever it might be. So he went to Reb Chanina Hagadol, and Reb Chanina Hagadol said, look, when it comes to teaching children, sure, if it'll be too much for them to handle one large pasuk, so you can cut it in half. But other than that, there's no reason why you should be cutting things in half. So answers Shmuel, but Hassam, at the end of the day, the reason over there, time am I, how come Reb Chananya Kara was allowed to cut the verse in half for the children? Mishum delo efshar. Because it was a situation where it was impossible otherwise. How could he teach the children verses if it was too much for them, right? If they're biting off more than they can chew? So therefore, Rabbi Chananya Kara was allowed to divide psukim in half, so because there was really no other option, right? If you want to teach the children, you had to divide it up into smaller chunks. Hachanami, so argues Shmuel, the same thing is over here. Lo efshar, we have an impossible situation, right? There's 5 psukim, they have to be read by 2 people. I'm sorry, one of the psukim is going to have to get cut in half, just like Reb Chanan Yekara was allowed to cut in half a pasuk because there was no alternative, because he had to teach the kids and they had to have smaller chunks. So here also, there's no alternative, right? There's 5 psukim, they need to be read by 2 people. One of the psukim is going to have to be chopped. Ushmuel Amar Posek, my time lo Amar Dolig. But how come Shmuel just can't say like Rav, repeat the 3rd pasuk, right? So both the first and second aliyah fellows will have the opportunity to read the 3rd pasuk. So Gezer Mishum Nechnosin Mishum Yotzin, because Shmuel is concerned about the people who come in late and the people who leave early, right? Argues Shmuel, what happens if the first guy reads the first 3 psukim, and then somebody in the shul leaves? He might think that the second person is only going to read 2 psukim, right? And we don't want him to think that. Or let's say you have a fellow who comes in late, right? You have a fellow who comes in late, and he gets there, and they're reading the second aliyah, and the second aliyah was 3 psukim, right? Pasuk 3, 4, and 5. So you might think that the first person only read 2 psukim, right? So again, if the first person reads 3 psukim, like if we say, like Shmuel argues that if we say like Rab, that both the first Oleh and the second Oleh read the 3rd pasuk. So the first Oleh is 1, 2, and 3. The second Oleh is 3, 4, and 5. So Shmuel's concerned that if somebody gets there late after the first Aliyah, so the first Aliyah, let's say the other way. If somebody leaves early, right? So he stayed for the first Aliyah, which was pasuk 1, 2, and 3, and then he leaves early. He might think that the second Oleh is only reading 4 and 5, which is not true, and he might get the wrong idea. Or if somebody gets there late, right, and he walks in and they're reading the second aliyah and it's psukim 3, 4, and 5, you might think that the first fellow only read 2 psukim. So therefore, in order to avoid that situation, says Shmuel that what you do is you just divide the 3rd pasuk in half, and therefore even if somebody comes in late, they see that, well, ultimately he's reading from 3 verses. Alright, that was fun stuff. Moving on. Meisre Vitake have Akasha Parsha Shoshisha Psukim Kornos B'Shnaim. Okay, so Bryce, again, we saw this Masechta Tainis, that a section that has 6 verses, so you can read it with 2 individuals, cut it in half. All right, V'Shel Chamisha Psukim B'Yochi, and if there are 5 verses, so then only one fellow should read that section, because how are you really going to divide it up? Now, Kara Rishon Shlosha, what happens in the event that you did divide up that 5-verse section, and the first person read 3 psukim, so now there's only 2 remaining. So, Hasheni Kare Shnai Miparsha Zo V'Echad Miparsha Acheres. So the second fellow is going to read the remaining 2 verses from this section, plus the first verse of the next section, so that there are 3 psukim in his aliyah. V'yeshom, there are those who say shlosha, that actually in addition to the last 2 psukim of the 5-verse section, he also reads the first 3 psukim, the first 3 verses of the whatever section of the Torah comes next. Right? So the Tanakama says that you read the remaining 2 verses plus the first verse of the next section, and the Yesh Omrim, the other opinion, says that he reads the remaining 2 verses of that section plus the first 3 verses of the next section. Because the Yesh Omrim, the additional opinion holds that you do not begin a new section and read less than 3 verses. You have to read at least 3 verses. Vim Isa, now, friends, this was the build-up. Here's the kasha. If what Rav and Shmuel are saying, Rav says you can repeat one of the psukim. Shmuel says that you cut one in half. So how come you have to even get the next section involved whatsoever? According to Rav, who says that you can repeat a verse, so this section has 5 verses. The first person read 3, so the second should just read 3, 4, and 5. And according to Shmuel, let them cut it in half. How come we're saying that if, the first person is going to read 3, so then you read the remaining 2 plus, either 1 or 3 of the next section. So shiny awesome. So it's different dar'in the efshir behachi. So the Gemara says, well, it's not really such a kasha. In that case, where we were saying move on to the next section and read 1 verse or 3 verses, so that was talking about where it was possible to do so. However, for example, in the Maimados, where there's a specific thing that they have to read, it was impossible to move on to the next section. That is why Rav and Shmuel argued about, do you cut it in half or do you repeat, because it wasn't possible to read the next section as well. Omer Tanchum, Omer B'Shuv ben Levi, so it says Reb Tanchum in the name of B'Shuv ben Levi, Halacha ki yesh omrim, that the halacha is like the yesh omrim, that if you have to read those final 2 psukim in the chapter, and then you start the next one, so you would read the first 3. V'Omer Reb Tanchum, Omer B'Shuv ben Levi, says Reb Tanchum in the name of Reb B'Shuv ben Levi, Kshem shein maschilin b'parsha pochis mi gimel psukim. So just like when you start a new section, you have to read at least the first 3 verses. So kach ein mishayin beparsha pochis mishlosh psukim. So also, when you get towards the end of a section, you make sure that there are at least 3 verses remaining. Right? You don't stop when there are only 2 or 1 verses remaining. Pshita. Now, in fact, wait a second. Shouldn't this be obvious? Because hashta u'ma'aschalta, when it comes to the beginning of the when it comes to beginning a new section, the kamekel tanakama, that the Tanakama is being lenient and saying that you only have to read the first pasuk of the next section. Machmire yesh omrim, the yesh omrim is being more stringent and saying no, 1 verse is not enough. You have to read at least 3 verses. So shiur, when it comes to how many verses are remaining, right? So for example, you have a section of 5 verses, and at what, or just so you have a section of 5 verses. So we're saying that we don't want you to leave. So really, we said that you have to read the whole thing, right? Because we don't want you to leave over less than 3. So the machmir Tanakama, that the Tanakama is being stringent, right? And saying, as I just said a second ago, that when you have a section of 5 verses, do not divide it up, because you want to make sure that you're not stopping with less than 3 verses left in the section. So the machmir Tanakama, where the Tanakama is being stringent, lo koshkin the machmir yesh omrim, then obviously the yesh omrim, who's stringent when it comes to starting the next section, is also going to be stringent when it comes to ending this section, i.e. that you cannot end it with less than 3 verses remaining in the section. So, and for the Gemara, not necessarily. Ma'adatema may have thought that people coming late is more common than people leaving, right? Because if we just take the section with 5 verses, so what would be the problem with reading just 3 of those 5 verses? Well, what if somebody leaves after those 3 verses and there are only 2 verses remaining in the section? They might think that, well, the next person is only going to be reading 2 verses, and that would be the concern there. Now, when it comes to starting the section, right? So the concern is about people who are coming in. That if somebody comes in late, so then we want to make sure that he realizes that you're reading at least 3 verses and not thinking that you're reading less than that. And therefore, you might be able to argue that according to the Yesh Omrim, they're more concerned about people coming in late, right? People coming in who will see, wait, why are you reading less than 3 psukim? How are you allowed to read less than 3 psukim? So they say, no, if you start a new section, you have to read at least 3 psukim, so that there's no doubts that you read at least 3 psukim. However, the Yesh Omrim maybe I would think that leaving in the middle when the Sefer Torah is already out is less common. And maybe they would say they would not have a problem with taking that section of 5 and reading only the first 3 verses, because nobody's leaving. Everybody's going to stay, and they'll see that, well, you're going to read the remaining 2 plus, from the next section as well. So therefore, I might think that the Yeshua might say that you actually can finish up in Aliyah when there are less than 3 psukim remaining. Kamash Malon. Someone's saying, so lo shchiche demanche sefer Torah v'nafke kamash Malon. Therefore, Rab Tanchum is saying in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi that no, the Yesh Omrim also say that when it comes to to ending in Aliyah, i.e., let's say you have a section with 5 verses, so you would read the entire section. Okay, what do you want me to tell you? Metanakama mai shno shiure de lo, and according to the Tanakama, how come he is concerned that, well, when you have a section of 5 verses, you have to read all of them, but when you start, you only have to read 1. Mishum yotzim, right? If we say that the reason why you have to read all 5 verses is because if you read only 3, then somebody who leaves in the middle might be, right? You might think you only read 2 more verses in the next aliyah. So also when you start the next section, shouldn't you have to be concerned about somebody who comes in the middle and thinks that you only read 1 verse? So Amri Manda'ayil Shayule Shayil. Well, they hold, the Tanakama holds that, well, if somebody comes in the middle and sees that they only read 1 verse, right, he'll just be like, yo, what's the deal? Why are they only reading 1 verse, friends? And they'll say, oh no, you just came late, buddy. They already read some verses before you got here. Peace out. Shalach le Rabba Brei Derava to Rav Yosef. So Rabba Brei Derava, he sent to Rav Yosef. Ooh, I'm very curious. What do you think he sent him? Hilchas Amai. He wants to know what the halach is. Alright, Shalach le. So Rav Yosef responded. Alright. Hilchas Adolik v'emtzai dolgon. Alright, well, there you go. That says Rav Yosef, the halacha is that when you have like by the Maimados, and you have those 5 verses that you have to divide into 2, so the halacha is like Rav, that you read the middle verse twice. Alright? Very, very cool stuff. Friends, moving on. So we said that in the Mishnah we said that the rule is that whenever there's a day that has musaf, but it's not a Yom Tov, for example, Rosh Chodesh, Chol HaMoed, right, they're not Yom Tiv, so they're not also Melacha, it's not Yom Tiv, and whatever other ramifications are. So it isn't Yom Tiv, but we say Musaf. So it's going to be 4 aliyas. So they want to know. Tanis Tzibur B'chamo. Oh, a public fast day. How many aliyas are there on a public fast day? So do we say Rosh Chodesh Umoed Diika Korban Musaf Arba'a? Do we say, look, on Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed where there's a Korban Musaf? Okay, so in that case we read 4 aliyas in the Torah. But on a public fast day, there's no korban musaf, so maybe it makes it different than Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, and it would only be 3 aliyas. Or perhaps hachanami, also by the fast days, ika musaf tefillah, right? We add, as we learned in Masechta Tainis, we add extra blessings to the Shmona Esrei. So maybe, right, there's also the musaf, right, the additions to the prayers. So maybe it makes it like Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed where there's musaf offerings, and therefore maybe it should also be 4 aliyas on a fast, on a public fast day. Tashma, come in here. B'rosh Chodashim u'v'chul Shamoed kohen arba'a. So we want to argue that, look, the Mishnah says that in Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed we read 4 aliyas. Habatanis Tzibur Gimel, implying that only in those 2 cases. But by public fast day, it would be 3 aliyas, right? By Chol HaMoed, by Rosh Chodesh 4, but by public fast day 3. But but 1 second. What about the fact that the Mishnah also said B'Sheni v'Chamishi u'V'Shabbos b'Mincha, that on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos b'Mincha Koren Gimel you read 3 aliyas? I can argue Hatanis Tzibur Arba'a, but on a public fast day you would read 4 aliyas. Okay, so forget it. We tried, at least we took a look at our Mishnah, and we tried to say tried to make an argument either way. Right? First we tried to say that maybe Tanis Tzibur should be 3 aliyas. Then we said maybe Tanis Tzibur should be 4 aliyas. We didn't make much headway. Okay, so the Gemara tries another approach. What does it try? Toshma, coming here. Rav iklu leBavel. Rav visited Bavel. Now what's interesting about this is apparently there was a city in Bavel called Bavel. I guess like there's a city in New York called New York. So, there's a city in Bavel called Bavel. B'tainis Tzibur, and it was a public fast. They kamkar b'sifra. So Rav got an aliyah. He read from the Torah. Amazing. Pasach barich chasim v'lo barich. So when he read from the Torah, he made a blessing beforehand, but he did not make a blessing afterwards. Naful kuliyama an payu v'ravlo naful al ape. When it came time for everybody to do tachanun, for everybody to kind of fall on their faces and do tachanun, Rav did not do that. Okay? Now, we're going to try to figure out from this anecdote if there should be 3 or 4 aliyas on a public fast day, based on what Rav did on that public fast day in Bavel. Mirde, let's see. Rav Yisrael Kara. Rav got the 3rd aliyah, right? If you could imagine, aliyah, so the first one we'll call Kohen, the second one we'll call Levi, the third one we'll call Yisrael. So the Gemara wants to say, look, Rav was not a Kohen, therefore he got the 3rd aliyah. And my time chosam v'lo barich. And how come if he got the 3rd aliyah, shouldn't he make a blessing afterwards? But he didn't. So lav mishum debayil mikra achrina basvei uah. So how come Rav didn't make a blessing after he received the 3rd aliyah? Mistame. It's because there's a 4th aliyah. That's what we want to say. Lo, the Gemara says no. Rav b'kohane kari. Rav got the 1st aliyah. Out of honor, right? Generally we give the 1st aliyah to a Kohen. But the point is the 1st aliyah is an honorable aliyah. And if there's a big Talmud Chacham there like Rav, so he can get the 1st aliyah. So Rav got the 1st aliyah. And that explains why he did not make a blessing afterwards, because it's the 1st aliyah. As we said in the Mishnah, right, you make a bracha before the Torah reading and at the end of the Torah reading, but not necessarily in the middle. And therefore, Rav got the 1st aliyah. That's what the Gemara wants to say. Rav Huna kari b'kahane, because after all, Rav Huna was not a Kohen, and yet he would get the 1st aliyah. Bishlomo Rav Huna kari b'kahane, da'afilu Rav Ami v'Rav Asi, dekane chashividar di'yisrael mekav kaifele. Again, so the Gemara says, look, I understand why Rav Huna would get the 1st aliyah, because again, Bishlama, I understand Rav Huna kari b'kahane, he would get the 1st aliyah. Da'afilu Rav Ami v'Rav Asi, even Rav Ami and Rav Asi, the Chahane Chashive the Arid Yisrael, who were the very special, very chosheva, very prominent priests of Eretz Yisrael, Mekav Kaifulei, they would defer to Rav Huna. So Rav Huna was very, very big stuff, and therefore I can understand why he got the 1st aliyah. Kaifulei Rav Huna. Ella. Rav, but what about, when in the context of Rav, what about Shmuel? Apparently, Shmuel was actually a Kohen, Udvar Ole, and was kind of on a higher level than Rav. So that's what the Gemara wants to say. The Gemara wants to say that Shmuel was on a higher level than Rav, and Shmuel was a Kohen. So if that's the case, then why would Rav, it wouldn't make sense that Rav would have gotten the 1st aliyah. To which the Gemara answers, no, that's not true. Shmuel nami mekav avakayev le lirav. No, that's not true. Shmuel actually subordinated himself to, deferred to Rav. Rav was on a higher level than Shmuel. V'Ravu da'avad le kovid, and when Rav showed honor to Shmuel, like for example, as Rashi points out, Rav would let Shmuel enter the Beis HaMedrash before him. That was just to give, Rav would give kavod to Shmuel, and it was specifically when he was with Shmuel, so he would give Shmuel honor, he would give him kavod, but outside, when he wasn't with Shmuel, so he wouldn't necessarily give him honor, and therefore, and not necessarily defer to him. So therefore, in this case, we could say that Rav got the 1st aliyah. It also makes sense to say that Rav got the first aliyah. The Rav b'chahane kara, right? It makes sense that Rav got the first aliyah. The Yisakadaitich b'Yisrael kara, because if it enters your mind to say that he got the third aliyah, lifonea my time of baruch. So then how come he's making a blessing beforehand, right? Right? We want to argue that maybe Rav got the third aliyah, and that explains why he did not make a blessing afterwards. Because there was a fourth aliyah coming. But one second, if we want to argue that Rav got the third aliyah, and he didn't make a blessing afterwards because there was a fourth aliyah, how come he made a blessing before the third aliyah? According to that logic, you should be making a blessing before all four aliyahs. So, right? Nami mistaba the Rabbi Kanikari the Sagadaitich b'Yisrael kara. So lifanei my time of baruch. So la'achar takana. So we want to say that it was after the enactment. Right nowadays, of course, we make a blessing before and after each aliyah. So we want to say that maybe Rav got his aliyah after the takana, after the enactment, to make a blessing before and after each aliyah. If that's the case, well, if we're saying that it was after the enactment, and therefore that's why he made a blessing beforehand, but then shouldn't he also make a blessing afterwards, even if he got the third aliyah? So shayni echad Yosef Rav Demeil Aile Mepak Lo Nafke. To which Sigmar says, well, it's different where Rav was, because people might come in the middle, and therefore if they come in the middle, we want to make a blessing before each aliyah so that they know that there was in fact a blessing that was made before the aliyah. Because if they come in the middle and they only made a blessing before all the aliyahs, well then they would, somebody who comes in the middle wouldn't necessarily know that they made a blessing before the aliyah. So therefore, that's why Rav made a blessing before his aliyah. But you can argue that he got the third aliyah, and there was really a fourth aliyah, and he didn't make a blessing after the third aliyah because we're not concerned that people are leaving, right? Mepak lo nafik. People don't leave in the middle, but they might come late. So therefore we make a bracha before but not afterwards. And you can argue that Rav really got the third aliyah out of four, and that there are 4 aliyas on a tainis tzibur. That's what the Gemara wants to potentially argue. Tashma, come and hear ze'aklal. This is the rule. Kol sheyesh bo bitul malacha. So on any day where if you add extra aliyas, so then people are going to be late to work. So le'am, to the nation, could go on. For example, tainis tzibur on a public fast day, v'tisha b'av, and on Tisha B'av, these are both days that you're technically allowed to work. So Korin Gimel, ho 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 ho. So you taka read 3 aliyas. And if there is no, if by adding aliyas you're not going to be late to work, la'am, to the nation, could go on. For example, Rosh Chodashim v'Chol Shamoed and Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, that we want to assume on those days, right? Certainly Chol Hamoed, you're not really doing proper work, and even Rosh Chodesh. So Korin Daled, so then we add an extra aliyah, we read 4 aliyas, Shema Mina. So what do we see? We said pretty clearly that on Tanis Tziburs and Tisha B'av you read 3 aliyas. So that seems pretty clear. Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi va'anon lo tnan hachi. But says Rav Ashi that if we look at our Mishnah, it doesn't seem to be saying that. What does it say in our Mishnah? Ze'aklal, this is the rule. Kol yom sheish bo musaf, any day that has a korban musaf, ve'eno yomtiv, and it's not a yomtiv, korin arba'a. You taka read 4 aliyas. Now, when it says ze'aklal, this is the rule. La'asuye mai. What's it coming to include in the rule? Lav la'asuye tainis tzibur v'tisha b'av is not coming to include that on a public fast day and on Tisha B'av you read 4 aliyas. So the Rav Ashi masnisin money, but according to Rav Ashi, who says that you're going to read 4 aliyas on a public fast day, well then who is the following Mishnah like? Remember the following brisa, Tanak, right? So I'm sorry. So our Mishnah, if what Rav Ashi is saying is correct, that when we say ze'aklal, that this general rule comes to include that also on public fast days you read 4 aliyas, well then who's the author of our Mishnah? Lo Tanakama v'lo Rav Yossi. It's neither the Tanakama nor is it Rav Yossi. What are their opinions? The Tanya is, we learn in the brisa, Chalils b'sheni u'v'chamishi, that if Tisha B'av falls out on a Monday or a Thursday, Korin Gimel umafter echad. So there are 3 aliyas, and the third aliyah says the haftarah, right? So if Tisha B'Av falls out on a Monday or Thursday, so there are 3 aliyahs, and the fellow who gets the third aliyah also reads the haftarah. B'shlishi v'revi'i, if Tisha B'Av falls out on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, kari echad, so just one fellow reads from the Torah, umaftir echad, and he also reads the haftarah. Okay, right? So according to that opinion, we see that depending on if Tisha B'Av falls out on a Monday or on a Thursday or a Tuesday and a Wednesday, so you read 3 aliyahs, 1 aliyah. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, La'olam Koren Gimel, Umaftir Echad. No, it's always, no matter which day of the week it falls out, you're always going to read 3 aliyahs, and then the fellow who gets the third aliyah does the haftarah. But neither of those opinions are that on Tisha B'Av you're going to have 4 aliyahs. Now, according to Rav Ashi, he says that on Tisha B'Av you have 4 aliyahs, but neither Tanna Kama nor Rabbi Yossi seem to be saying that. So, where am I? Fine. Ve'ela kasha ze haklal. But then what about, Rav Ashi is making a point, right? He's saying, look, when it says in the Mishnah, ze haklal, this is the general rule that any day that it has a musaf but is not Yom Tif, you have 4 aliyahs. And then it lists Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed. What else is being included in that general rule? Rav Ashi wanted to say that it's public fast days, but we seem to be saying that on Tisha B'Av you only read 1 or 3, not 4. So lav la'asuy, right? So la'asuye mai, so la'asuye Rosh Chodesh u'Moed. So we want to say, well, if that's the case, so then this general rule is coming to include Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, but ha'behedja katani la Rosh Chodashim u'Moed koren arba'ah. But one second, what do you mean? Ze'aklal, this general rule isn't coming to include Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, because the Mishnah explicitly said that on Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed there are 4 aliyahs. So then what is being included in the 4, in this general rule? So, Simana Ba'alma Yoiv, so the Gemara says, no, really it is just by Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed that you have 4 aliyahs. Tema, and when it says Ze'aklal, this is the general rule. It's just giving a siman, like a sign. Tema, that you shouldn't say Yom Tiv v'chulu shamoed ki adadininu, that Yom Tiv and Chol HaMoed are the same halacha, that it's 5 aliyahs. Ella nikotai klala biyadcha, rather, hold on to the following rule, which is called the tafile milsa mechavre tafile gavre yisera. That on each day where it goes up one level of strictness, so then it gets an extra aliyah. Meaning, Hilkach Rosh Chodesh u'Moed Dika Korban Musaf Korban Arba. Therefore, on Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, where there's one step up in that there's a Korban Musaf that's offered, so then there's 4 aliyos as opposed to 3. But Yom Tiv Da'asu B'Asiyas Malacha, when it comes to Yom Tiv, which was an additional step up, because it's actually also to do Malacha, so then there is Chamisha, there's 5 aliyas. But Yom Kippurim Danush Karis, when we up the ante shtickle on Yom Kippur, where if you violate Yom Kippur, there's a Chiyuv Karis, Shisha, so then 6 aliyas. Shabbos, Dika Isser Skila, Shiva. And on Shabbos, where things get so intense that if a fellow intentionally violates the Sabbath, he gets stoned. And the death penalty kind of stoned, and therefore, because it's pretty intense, so therefore there's 7 aliyahs. Oh, very interesting. 7 aliyahs on Shabbos, because if you violate Shabbos, you get stoned. All right, what am I to tell you? Okay, fine. So that is that rule. Gufa, we said earlier, Rav Megilla Bavel B'Tanis Tibur. Okay, so we said earlier that Rab visited Bavel, the city of Bavel, on a fast day, a public fast day. Kamkar B'Sifra, he read from the Torah, Pasach Baruch Chasam Lo Baruch. He made a blessing at the beginning of his aliyah, but not at the end. Nafal Kuli Alma Anpai Vravlo Nafal Al Anpe. And then we said that everybody at one point went to say tachanun, to fall on their faces, but Rab did not do that. My time of Rav Lunafal Alape. So the Gemara wants to know, how come Rav did not fall on his face? How come Rav did not, fall on his face when everybody else said tachanun? So Ritzba shel avonim haisa. So my answer is, well, the floor was made out of stone. Vitanya, we learn in the Brisa of Evan Maskas lo sidnu ba'atzchem nishtachvos aleo, that don't have hewn stone in your land to bow down upon it. And yes, we can't bow down on stone outside of the Beis Hamikdash, but in the Beis Hamikdash you are allowed to bow down on stone. And like Ula says, that the Torah prohibits a floor made out of stone, ultimately for bowing down on it. Bilvad. And that's it. And therefore, Rav did not bow down because it was a stone floor. If that's the case, my area Rav afilu kulunami. So how come only Rav did not want to bow down on the stone floor? Nobody should have been bowing down on the stone floor. How come it was only Rav? So kamid Rav havoy. So the Gemara says, well, the stone floor area was only where Rav was. Well, if the stone area was only by Rav, why didn't he just go where everybody else was and bow down with them? And fall on his face. Well, he didn't want to bother everybody, because if he would get up to go over there, everybody would stand up for him. He didn't want to make a whole big deal, so he just stayed where he was. Alright. If you want to say, Rav Pishut Yadayim V'Raglayim, I have an Ovid, that Rav, when he would bow down, he would do Pishut Yadayim V'Raglayim. He would get on the floor and extend his hands and his legs, and that's something that we would not do on a stone floor. And like what Ula says, Lo asur Torah ela pishut yadayim v'raglayim bilvad, that what's not allowed is extending your hands and legs on the floor, and that's how Rav bowed, and therefore he didn't bow in this case because he does pishut yadayim v'raglayim. And it was a stone floor. Okay, but why didn't Rav just make an exception? I know he likes to do Pishut Yadayim V'Raglayim, but in this case, why not just, do what everybody else is doing? So, Lo Mishani Miminhaga, he didn't want to change his minig. If his minig was to lie down on the ground and do Pishut Yadayim V'Raglayim, so that's what he was going to do. And if you can't do it because the stone floor, is just simply not going to do it at all. By same, if you want, I will say, Adam Chashuv Shiny, that things are different when it comes to an important person like Rav. Like Rabbi Elazar, we believe we saw this also in Tainus. Tainus Daf Yudalid. Dam Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Elazar, Adam Chashuv Rasha Lipal Alponov, that an important fellow is not allowed to fall on his face, Ella Imkain, Nena Kishua Benun, unless he knows that he's going to be answered, like Yoshua Benun, Dechsev, Vayom Hashem al Yoshua, Kumloch, V'gomer, why are you, right? God says to Joshua, get up, how come you are falling on your face? So he said that unless you know for sure that you're going to be answered, then don't fall on your face. Rav avoided this whole thing, and he did not fall on his face. Very interesting. Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, Kida alapayim, that Kida, if ever you see Kida, it means on your face. Shnemar, as the pasuk says, Vatikod Basheva apayim arza, that Basheva bowed down her face to the ground. Kriya al berkaim, when it says Kriya, it means on the knees. And similarly it says Mikra al birkav, from bowing down on his knees. Ishtachava lo pishut yadayim v'raglayim, and bowing down is extending your hands and your legs. Shnemar, as the pasuk says, Havu navo ani v'imcha v'achecha l'shtachavos l'cha arza. That Yaakov Avinu says to Yosef when he tells the dreams, he says, what, are me and your mother and your father going to bow down to you on the ground? Right? So Yaakov says, what, are we all just going to go and bow down to you on the ground? So we see that bowing down, the shtachavot, is dafka pishut yadayim v'raglayim, on the ground, spreading out your hands and your legs. Right? Sounds like a lot of fun. Levi ach ve'kido kame de Rebbe v'idla, as we've seen, I believe, for the third time, that, or maybe even the fourth time, I don't know, that Levi, he sort of did this very fancy thing where he could balance himself on his thumbs, or so he thought, in front of Rebbe by the Simchas Beis HaShuev v'itla, and he became disabled because of it. Wait, is it true that he became disabled because of this fancy breakdancing trick in front of Rebbe. Rabbi Lazar says, a fellow should never be disrespectful towards the Eibishter, because there was a very great fellow who didn't speak very nicely to the Eibishter, and he became disabled. Umanu, and who is that? Levi. It is Levi. So how could it be that we're saying that Levi is simply got permanently injured when he was doing a dance in front of Rebbe? I thought that he got permanently injured because he was being disrespectful to God. Umanu Levi, and it was Levi. So the Gemara says, well, it was both. Because he spoke inappropriately to God when the opportunity arose to make him disabled when trying to balance himself on his thumbs in front of Rebbe, that is what caused it. So, bowing in front of Rebbe in such a way was just sort of a way for him to get punished for being disrespectful to God. Amr Chia bar Oven says of Chia bar Oven, Chazinu luhu la'abaye v'rava. I saw by Rava the Matzah Etzluya that when they would do tachanun, they would fall, they would lean over and they wouldn't fall on their face, they would just kind of lean over. I guess similar to what we do when we say tachanun. Friends, that was daf Chav Beis of Masechta Megillah. We began the daf with the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel about what do you do when you have 5 psukim. Rav says that you would repeat the middle one. Shmuel says that you would cut it in half. We then talked about how many verses can you leave over in a section of the Torah, and how many do you have to read when you start a new one. So we said that don't stop an aliyah with less than 2 verses left in the section, with less than 3 verses left in the section. And also if you start a new section, so then we saw it was machlokas within the Tanakama and the Yesh Omrim, sort of another opinion. Tanakama says you only have to read the first pasuk of the next section. The Yesh Omrim, the other opinion, is that you have to read the first 3 verses. Then we asked the question, how many aliyas are there on a public fast day? And we tried to bring some proofs. So ultimately we brought a proof from we tried to bring a proof from the story with Rav that maybe there were 4 aliyas, but then we ultimately brought a brisa that said that there are 3 aliyas when it comes to Tisha B'Av, i.e. Public fast days. And then we talked about bowing down, because Rav didn't bow down, and we gave 3 potential answers. One is because it was a stone floor, and he didn't want to bow down on a stone floor. The other one was that he specifically was doing Pishut Yadayim V'Raglayim, and that he couldn't do on a stone floor. And finally, perhaps he didn't say tachanun because he was a very great man, and a very great man shouldn't sort of fall on his face unless he knows he's going to be answered, like Yoshua ben Nun. Friends, that was Daf Chav Beis of Masechta Megillah. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.